iLearn's featured plenary speaker, Lieutenant Zachary Bales, with the reality and virtual reality of modern police training. Take it away, Lieutenant Bales.
Hey. Hello, everybody out there. I hope everybody's doing well today. This is a whole new experience for me today, so I'm excited to be here and join you all virtually. I don't get the pleasure of having dinner with somebody at the end of today, but I think this is a pretty interesting and fun way to bring some information to everybody and that we can share across the globe, so I'm very excited. So as Heather mentioned, my name is Zachary Bales. I am a lieutenant with the City of Sacramento Police Department. I have been a police officer for nearly 20 years. Prior to that, I was an Army officer and an armored cavalry officer, actually. And I have been a lifelong resident of the state of California. So today's brief presentation will be about 35 minutes, I'm hoping, where I'll present some information. And then for the second half, I'm going to open it up for just questions about the presentation, the topic, or general questions. I'm more than happy to answer any of that for everybody at the end of the presentation. But what we're going to explore today is just what kind of training police officers are doing right now and what the look is in the future. And then I'm also going to discuss how virtual reality is being integrated into the larger police education philosophy and curriculum altogether. So if anybody referenced my abstract, I'll just take a few lines out of that. Today's environment for policing in the United States is one of turmoil, and one could even argue crisis. The news cycle is consistently feeding on a diet of police and citizen stories. And it's become pretty contentious to the point where it's costing millions of dollars to local jurisdictions in civil unrest and detracting from the economy. Often these conversations start to revolve around police reform. And that reform often moves in the direction of training and how do we have training to create better outcomes for police officers and their citizens on the streets. The problem with that assumption is that most folks don't know what is involved in police training. Just like I generally know what it takes to become a dentist. I know you have to go to medical school, and I know you have to go to dental school, and I know that there's some on-the-job training, but I sure don't know all of the different ins and outs of the training, and I'd be hard-pressed to tell you what better and more training dentists need in order to better perform their job. So we're going to explore a few of those topics today, but to begin with, if I can direct your attention to right-hand side of the stage from the audience, I'm going to play a quick recent video from the media that was just a local news story. We've been covered significantly from CNN to a bunch of local media outlets, but this is a recent story that they did on our VR there. Just a moment to upload.
Eric and Nikki, I had an opportunity to try out this virtual reality training. I had a headset on. I was armed with some plastic weapons, and by the end of it, I was sweaty. My heart was beating fast. It felt like the real deal.
You're looking for the real deal.
With a virtual reality headset on and weapons in hand, the mock scene I'm placed in is at a school with screaming kids running up to find safety. Someone is armed with a gun. As I turn the corner, I see the suspect has a student in a chokehold, holding the gun to the student's head. so I tell the suspect to drop the gun and let the student go. The suspect partially complies, so I tell the suspect again to drop the gun. She does, but then she starts to rush me, so I tase her with no effect. Before I know it, she's face to face with me, raising her right hand like she has a weapon. I shoot twice, and she goes down. A police lieutenant tells me I just shot an unarmed person. This entire training scenario was less than a minute. It's that kind of real-life, full immersion training that Sacramento police officers and cadets are now undergoing, with the goal of having the best trained cops out on the streets.
We have to get better. We have to get better as a society and specifically as law enforcement and tackle these issues that we've dealt with for hundreds of years. So this virtual reality is just one part of a much broader effort through training, experiences, equipment, technology that our department has been researching and implementing over the last several years.
These officers are in a virtual space. We draw upon the lessons learned from out in the field right now. Traffic stops, disputes of all kinds, domestic disputes.
These two officers each have at least 14 years with the department. They say the virtual training is legit.
From a training standpoint, it's a good tool to have.
We get more training here and just gives us other options to work with the virtual system.
And we try our best to have the best human beings in these uniforms, but sometimes, as we've seen around the country, there are people that make their way into this uniform that have no business wearing it.
Now, this training is at the police academy. It's not only open to cadets, but existing officers will also have to undergo this new training. Reporting live from police headquarters tonight, Rowena Shaddix, Fox 40 News.
Okay, so that was just a quick introduction into topic today and what we're gonna talk about. So in front of you, I didn't have the ability to. I'm all thumbs on a keyboard. Didn't have the ability to make my animations work on my slides, but we'll start at the top of this graphic. In the United States, there's about 327 million residents. That count was as of a few years ago. And annually, out of those 327 million residents, there's about 53.5 million police contacts a year. Out of those police contacts, there's about 10 million arrests that occur each year. Out of those 10 million arrests, there's just under 1 million uses of force, all the way from putting your hands on someone and using some sort of control hold, all the way up to less lethal and potentially lethal force. Out of those 1 million uses of force, it occurs in death occurs in about 1,000 of those cases. Out of those 1,000 deaths that occur, right around a handful. It's difficult because there's not a one centralized collection body that collects these statistics, but it's estimated that there's approximately 100 of those 1,000 that are considered controversial, and out of that, even a less amount that make it to the criminal process that are prosecuted for some sort of criminal wrongdoing. So these handful of murders that cause a significant reaction in our country currently is pretty small comparatively to the 53 million police contacts that occur a year. In 2016, Johns Hopkins University published an 8-year study that concluded that about 250,000 people, 250,000 people a year, die from medical mistakes. And so the CDC had a number that was closer to 150,000 annually of people that die from medical mistakes. But when we compare the collective attention of 250,000 people dying from an error in a profession to the 1,000 deaths, or even out of those thousands, the potentially unjustified deaths, we're working with a pretty small portion. Now, that said, that small portion, that margin that ends up being unjustified or illegal, causes significant reaction and unrest and undermines our institutions altogether. And so we take it very seriously. In the law enforcement profession, we take working in those margins and improving outcomes as a primary objective in what we're doing, even though a majority of our contacts, a large majority of our contacts, end up in almost, as you can see, almost always a outcome that does not result in injury or death. So just to put it in context, since I'm not sure where folks are around the world, slide does not seem to be moving here. There we go. So to let you folks know where I am at, I live and work in the state of California, in the city of Sacramento, which is, just to put it in perspective, California is the most populous state in the nation. We have 11% of our United States citizens living here in this state. City of Sacramento is the 35th largest city in the United States. And that's important because a lot of metrics that come out of major metropolitan areas are out of the top 50 or top 100 size metropolitan police departments around the country. Sacramento Police Department is the 5th largest municipal agency in California. So we're a fairly sizable agency. We're not quite at the level of LAPD or San Francisco PD, but we're a little bit, we're pretty far up there. So here's just some quick city demographics to put it into perspective for you of the environment in which our police officers work. The city of Sacramento itself is just over 500,000 people. We occupy just over or just under 100 square miles. The average age is about 33 years old. And the average household income, or the median, I'm sorry, household income is just under 55,000. About 86 or closer to 87% of our citizens are high school graduates, and just under a third have a bachelor's degree or more. Our poverty rate is around 16%. Bachelor's degree or higher, next to a stat next to it that about 73% of our Sacramento Police Department officers hold a bachelor's degree or higher. And I say that because there's current legislation popping up around the country, including in California, about the potential of requiring a bachelor's degree for police officers. Now, just in perspective of our profession, some would argue this, but it's generally held that from the East Coast to the West Coast, that police departments are more progressive and generally more professionalized, meaning they require more education, they require more ongoing education, and generally the average salary for a police officer, an entry-level police officer, is higher, from starting lower end on the East Coast and moving up as you move to the West Coast. So as you move to the West Coast, it's considered much more of a profession and much less of a job. Here's some quick facts about the department. That's our mission statement up above. It's pretty standard for police departments. They have, every police department has their own variation of it, but it's very standard. Our annual budget is about $165 million a year. We have about 756 sworn officers, 347 professional staff. And just to put that in perspective, Sacramento Police Department is the lowest staffed police department per capita of the 50 largest metropolitan cities in the United States. And I mentioned that because that's actually created some challenges where we've derived some great opportunities out of that. And for the last decade and a half, because we have been strapped for people, we have looked for any and all innovative ways to become efficient as we administer public safety. And I believe that we've used that to our advantage to really become on the cutting edge of seeking innovation in our profession altogether out of necessity. And often change happens out of necessity for all sorts of professions. I can see online, commensurate with other major metropolitan cities around the country, violent crime is on the rise. It's no different in Sacramento. And just as a tidbit, violent crime is up, and shootings are up 144% for us over the last year. So, as we all know, catalyst events can drive new direction. As you can see up on the slide there, those are a couple of photos from a local event. You may be familiar with it if you follow police news at all, but Stephon Clark was a man who was shot in a backyard here in Sacramento a couple of years ago. He had a cell phone in his hand, which he was pointing at police officers like it was a gun after he had run from them. It was a significant event in our city and around the state, and it caused protests around the country. Not quite to the level of George Floyd, but significant. The beginning of what we would call the new era or new paradigm in policing really started in 2014 with the Michael Brown event in Ferguson, Missouri. Since then, there's been a new narrative and a new vigor to reform the police. On the bottom right-hand side, that was Officer Tara O'Sullivan, who was murdered in 2019 here in Sacramento on the job. She was shot by a suspect who was armed and held inside of a house. So these catalyst events, at least for us and around another other agencies around the country, they often drive change. So legislation, policy, activism, all of these things contribute to a narrative towards reform. We in law enforcement, and especially in the police department, have learned or tried to learn since 2014 that while these events need to be analyzed and we need to create change out of them, we need to do better than that. We need to be proactive in seeking change. We need to be proactive in seeking best practices and best outcomes on the street. So, to quote a well-used book, "Who Moved My Cheese?" We really need to smell the cheese and smell the change coming, and to try and seek new cheese as we try and navigate the events, especially in such a volatile environment. That's kind of where my current position derived out of. We're trying to evolve and need to become a learning culture. So a couple of years ago in Sacramento, we started my unit, which is the Research Development and Training Division. So I am the second manager of it. There was a first manager that was here for a short period of time that started with the staffing, started with the development of what exactly the mission of our unit was going to be. And then I came in, and I've been here for just over 2.5 years. And what we're really trying to do in this unit is what I mentioned, which is develop a learning culture, become a high-performance team as a police department. We are futures oriented and really trying to look at strategic planning from a 5, 10, 15, even 20-year outlook, and try and anticipate change and anticipate where we need to go for the profession and what we need to be prepared to do in order to remain active and relevant parts of our community. And that is what my unit does philosophically. What we do brass tacks is we research best practices, we develop best practices, tactics, techniques, and procedures. Then we train them into our police officers here in Sacramento. And then we measure the outcomes of those training developments, and then we assess from there and try to improve even the newly implemented changes. So I'm going to shift gears here for a minute, and I'm going to talk about what I alluded to before, and I'm going to give a quick rundown on what it takes to get hired as a police officer all together. And you'll see a few headlines there. Lawmakers zero in on police hiring and training. Would hiring older recruits stem the tide of police shootings? Our former President Trump calls for improved hiring and training standards. And like I mentioned before, that's all well and good, but most of those folks don't know currently what is the standard to hire a police officer? What is the standard to ensure that the person of character and of sound judgment enters a position in which an officer can take life or liberty based on an observation, based on what they see on scene. It's one of the most powerful positions that we give to any one of our citizens. So it's important that we hire the right people to enforce the laws that we all collectively as citizens ask to be enforced to maintain social order. So I'm going to put this super simple slide up there for you. This is a chart diagram of the hiring process for a police officer. I have some knowledge of this because for 2 years I was the backgrounds investigation supervisor along with our recruiting supervisor. And so I basically, once someone applied to the police department, supervised the entire process of them have a background investigation completed on them and submitting them to the deputy chief of police or the chief of police for hire. So this process that you're looking at varies from police department to police department. On the West Coast, it's a fairly standard process, but that is one of the issues throughout the United States for policing, is that as you move throughout the United States, you'll find vastly different hiring standards, hiring practices, and what they consider in their candidates. There is no central set of standards throughout the United States. In California, we have the Peace Officer Standards and Training entity, which is the regulatory body for all of the police departments and sheriff's departments in California. They have a minimum set of standards for hiring and training. And so it creates a decent set of standards for the state. But throughout the United States, you go to whatever state, their standards are going to be slightly different, and in some cases, much, much less. So this process you'll look at least for our department and most departments on the West Coast, takes anywhere from 9 to 12 months just to get through this hiring process. So an applicant starts with an application and then takes a written exam. After they pass the written exam, they're invited to an oral assessment exam where it's like a panel interview. They answer a few questions and they can pass or fail that. After they pass that, they're invited to a physical agility test where they have to take a work sample battery test, which includes a couple of physical tests like dragging a dummy, getting over a wooden wall, getting over a chain link fence, sprinting through a 99-yard obstacle course. They're all work-related tasks that they have to get a certain score on. If they pass that, we'll ask them for basically a personal history statement and waivers in order to check out their background. They will do a 4-phase background process, which includes interviews of family, friends, acquaintances, prior jobs. There's several different dimensions, including financial and academic, and I think I have to remember back, but there's like 10 different dimensions in which they're evaluated. If they get through that process, they're subjected to a polygraph test. If they are past that, they will then potentially get a conditional job offer based on an interview with the deputy chief of police. After that conditional job offer based on hiring law, at least in California, will then be subjected to a psychological exam, a medical exam, and then they get hired. During the pre-hire process, they'll work as a pre-hire around our department, get acclimated to it if they have the ability, and then they'll attend the academy. So once they get to the academy, what training does it take to become a police officer? If you look up on the slide there, I put a few graphics from some stories from CNN comparing how many hours, and like I mentioned, it varies from state to state. You can see this is CNN's interpretation of how many hours it takes to become a police officer compared to other professions. North Carolina, for instance, they say that it takes 620 hours to become a police officer, but 1,500 to become a barber. Massachusetts, you can see there that it's 900 hours, Florida 770, and California you can see is at 664, and a licensed cosmetologist is at 1,600. Along with the question, is police education, or I'm sorry, the statement, police education is broken, and the question, can it even be fixed? So just to put this in context, that those graphics were taken from a story in 2016, and last month, CNN did another story in the same vein where they concluded that you actually can't tell, you can't compare apples to oranges and say what training it takes to become a police officer compared to some of these other professions. And this is the reason why. So 664, just keep that number in mind there as the popular belief of what it takes to become a police officer. In our police department, once you get hired, you go to 200 hours of training prior to the start of the police academy. We call it pre-academy, but it includes some basic ethics courses, some procedural justice courses, some basic search and seizure law, physical fitness, just some general theory and ethics courses. So along with some community-oriented policing, problem-oriented policing courses that they attend. Once they complete a pre-academy successfully, they attend the actual police academy. At Sacramento, we administer our own police academy. There's only a few larger agencies that do this throughout the United States. So we don't only train Sacramento police officers, we train police officers for many of the police agencies in the surrounding region. And if you're familiar with the area, all the way up from South Lake Tahoe down into the Bay Area and the Valley, along with several state agencies, attend the Sacramento Police, send their recruits to the Sacramento Police Academy for training. So after the 200 hours of pre-academy, recruits go through 940 hours of training in the police academy. During that academy, they cover 42 different post-regulated learning domains that covers all basic aspects of the job of policing. After they graduate from the academy, they attend, the Sacramento police recruits attend 200 hours of additional training immediately upon graduation and prior to the start of field training. This includes several community-based organization presentations, critical incident training, which is how to deal with people in mental crisis. They cover basic collision courses, so get some more advanced training in driving under the influence and some other things that are above and beyond the police academy itself. Keeping count, so far, before a person has hit the streets, they have gone through a hiring and backgrounds process that's, I don't think that any of those other professions have, that takes anywhere from 9 months to 12 months to get through. Our minimum to become a police officer in the city of Sacramento, you have to have the equivalent of an associate's degree or at least 60 units of undergraduate work. And then you get into our training inside the police department. If you added up those hours before an officer even steps onto a city street or gets into a city police car with a loaded firearm, they've already attended 1,340 hours of training. After that 1,300 hours and 40 hours of training, they are then subjected to 800 to 1,000 hours of field training. And that's under the direct supervision of a field training officer who rides in the car with them, evaluates them on every single call, and ensures that they are delivering the service in which they are trained to do. So add all of that up, you're somewhere in the realm of 2,300 hours. But again, it's hard to compare that. So once they get out of, officers get out of training, what do we do to maintain our skills? And this varies obviously from profession to profession, but most professions have ongoing training that's required. If you're an elementary school teacher like my wife is, she has to go to ongoing training in order to ensure that she stays current with all the latest and greatest in learning methods and curriculum and all sorts of different aspects of teaching. Police have to do the same. So you can see on the slide there, a few things that have been instituted from legislation and policy about police getting mandatory training, imposed training, de-escalation mandatory training, the crisis intervention training, which I mentioned is dealing with people in mental crisis, implicit bias training, things of that nature. So I want to introduce you to what we do in my division, which is basically the graduate level work of maintaining and improving tenured police officers' training. In front of you, you'll see the current curriculum for this year's presentation, which is mandatory for every single police officer in our department. This is just the lowest level or minimum amount of training that is required of a police officer. In addition to driver's training, so the driver's training is not part of this, but we have mandatory driver's training because, believe it or not, we drive a lot of miles and we don't want to be running into folks. That really destroys trust when you rear end somebody in a police car. So we do a lot of driver's training as well. Besides that, you'll see that there's a 40-hour schedule here in which we remove someone from their primary job function, whether that's a detective or a SWAT officer or a patrol officer, whatever capacity, and they attend what we call CPT or continued professional training. Put it up here just so you can see some of the topics that we do. The officers this year, they start with a full day of wellness. They get suicide prevention and resource information in the morning. They take a physical fitness test in the morning. And then in the afternoon, they go to selected breakout sections, anywhere from mindfulness to injury prevention to financial wellness to yoga, all on sort of a elective basis. Following day, they get an hour lecture on the updates to use of force policy. Our use of force policy is constantly evolving. So every year it's important that we talk about it and review the current policy. Our current policy for use of force is 20 pages long. It's pretty comprehensive. We talk about case law and then how we apply that to the real world of solving problems in streets. After that lecture, they'll break up into a couple of groups. They'll go to the range for firearms training or to a mat room to get some arrest control tactics training. But on the range training is probably not what you envision, targets downrange and officers just firing off a bunch of rounds. What we do is dynamic range training where they will start with some live fire, but then they quickly move into some movement, some team movement, and then we run a scenario this year on after an officer involved shooting, getting the team to work together quickly with a shield to approach the person and administer first aid. And then they're immediately required to administer first aid on the dummy at the range, but going through all of the proper steps to administer that first aid to that potentially lethal suspect in which they just had to engage. And then they, in the afternoon, they spend some time on some physical attributes of grappling and self-defense. Following day, they go through a block of innovations in technology where we update them on all the latest tools that we have, like we're currently moving to the Taser 7, our UAS program, our drone program. We have several different levels of drone and levels in which we deploy different drones, our real-time crime center, things like that. They get an update from the deputy chiefs for about an hour to talk about vision and direction of the department, and the chiefs will answer questions. In the afternoon, this is fairly innovative for, I think, a department our size. The chief of police himself teaches a cultural competency portion of our class to every single police officer. He really finds it important and understands the impact that it has when the chief of police himself delivers that. Now, if any of you work for a university or a corporation that has, 1,400 employees, you can imagine the CEO or the dean coming to individually talk to a group 18 to 24 weeks a year. That person really values the education and the time in which they're spending to deliver that message. Our chief does that. We spend the rest of the afternoon on some critical incident training, tactical or strategic communications, de-escalation, and then a class on peer intervention. And what does that look like when officers have to detect and then actually intervene with a peer? On Friday, they get a block on critical decision making, which I'm going to talk about in a few minutes. And then they spend the rest of the day doing reality-based training scenarios. We have a tactical village here. It's basically a little city inside of a huge warehouse in which we run scenarios with determined metrics and learning objectives. And we throw some pretty hairy problems at the officers, and they have to bring to bear all of the different things that they learned throughout the week in these scenarios, including peer intervention, de-escalation, and implicit bias training. So what's the point of all this training? The training really, and I'll talk about the technology in a second, the training is really used to accelerate the experiences of an officer. And that's what technology really can do for us, especially in the training. Now, in technology, you can see on the slide there, one of our drones, our CAD system and mapping system, GPS location. You'll see up one of our police observation devices that have live feed cameras and license plate readers. You can see our analysis tools with hotspots and analyzing crime patterns. Shot spotter, which detects live shots fired. We have a lot of tools at our disposal, but how does that change our environment in which we're trying to administer a pretty classic service to people, which is to solve problems when they need help? In the operations world, we use all of those tools to try and make our job more efficient. In the training world, virtual reality is the latest and greatest in technology that's going to help us. Now, for over a decade, we've had video simulators, multi-screen simulators, force option simulators. They were two-dimensional or one-dimensional and sort of reactive, but virtual reality is a whole new world, and it really is going to be used as a tool for experience. And you can see in the in pictures there, that's actually me in the middle in Las Vegas evaluating the system that we were looking at. But what we're really trying to do is not use the virtual reality trainer as a a marksmanship tool or a tool to ensure that proper leadership is administered, all very important. But what we're using it for is a decision-making tool, a judgment tool. So in front of you, you're going to see our critical decision-making model. It's from PERF, which is a national organization for policing, but this is a variation on that. And what virtual reality training does is it gives us the opportunity with a low logistical tail and the ability to run tons of people through experiences. And experience matters. So in one of the previous slides, you'll see like we want to hire older officers, or we don't want rookie officers on the streets. There's all sorts of ideas of thinking that we're going to improve outcomes on the street if we improve training and experience. There's something to the experience. Take a 15-year veteran. A lot of things for a 15-year veteran are autonomous. And we've done a lot of research and looking into cognitive behavior and autonomy. And if you compare it to driving, if any of you have teenagers or someone you've tried to teach driving lately, or remember yourself, when you first start driving, you have to remember to look at your side mirror, look at the rear view mirror, look at your speedometer, look how far the person is in front of you, try and read the street signs. Oh yeah, remember to maintain your lane. It's an exhausting endeavor to try and drive from your house to the store when you're a new driver. I would bet if any of you drove somewhere today that you probably don't remember even 3 of the steps that you took to drive there. Most of us drive autonomously after we've been doing it for a few years. And initially, it's an extremely taxing endeavor. Well, with experience, we know from science that things become autonomous. Now in policing, that can be dangerous because of complacency and not being able to read a situation properly. However, for most things, it's just like driving. We can allow the officer to free up brain space and brain energy to solve complex problems if most of the things that they are doing on a call for service are autonomous. And that's where the critical decision-making model comes from, or comes into play. You can see in that model, we start at collect information at the top, and then we expect officers to assess the situation, the threats, the risk, and possibility of escape for both the suspect and themselves. They have to consider law and policy. Then they identify options and determine the best course of action. Once they do that, they act on that course of action, and then they review and reassess and collect more information and go around in a circle. All of that, of course, is surrounded by our ethics, values, proportionality, and our sanctity of life, along with our general mission. That only comes. It's a complex decision-making model, but that only comes after a lot of other things are autonomous. So what we're trying to do with virtual reality is accelerate the experience as an officer so that they can go through a certain type of call 10, 15, 20, 30, 100 times if need be, until things become autonomous enough that they are using their higher brain function to do this, which slows down a call for service, presents more options for an officer, and allows them to have a better outcome because things are slowing down for them. They are seeing more. They are, in the driving metaphor, driving defensively and are able to anticipate bad things happening. And that's what we're trying to move for the future. The future of law enforcement, we're going to really have to decide, along with society together, what is our role and what are we expected to do and what are we expected to deliver for our local communities. And one of the main things that we need to do is ensure that we are providing the best training using the latest technology to train these people to make sure that they have the best possible chance of making the best choices to provide for the best outcomes in policing. So with that, I'm going to wrap it up. I went a few minutes too long. I apologize, but I'm going to turn on my webcam over here so that you can actually see me answering. And I'm going to answer any questions that folks have. So I'll hand it over to Heather, and we can answer any questions anybody have.
Sure, I gotcha. All right, so there were some questions in the chat. Let me see if I can come back and get them for you. Thank you very much, people in the chat, by the way, who've been asking questions. I think I'm going to just, for the sake of efficiency, go in backwards order. But there was a bit of a question with relevance to the training that you were talking about, Lieutenant Bales, about whether the officers actually live in the neighborhoods where they are going to police. And so I think that is connected to this judgment idea, to this idea of getting experience before they actually go on the job.
Yes, so that's a great question. There are programs throughout the United States. There have been programs previously in Sacramento where you have the neighborhood police officer or the officer next door, where there's subsidies to getting police officers to live in the neighborhoods in which they police. We do have officers that live within the city limits, but a majority of them live outside of the city limits for various reasons. Newer officers can't afford to live in Sacramento, except for in some very poor socioeconomic areas, and they can find a better location to live just outside the city. And others can't or have a difficult time dealing with working in a neighborhood and never being able to turn it off or relax or be able to be in an area where they're not expected to be doing their job, even if they're at the grocery store or at a restaurant. I don't live in the city myself, but I often come to the city to dine and shop. And there have been several times where I'm with my wife and kids, and there's someone out in front of the restaurant that I've arrested that knows who I am. And it's difficult to have a relaxing experience and just go to dinner if you're worried about that person causing a scene, possibly getting into a physical altercation with you because you've recently arrested them. So it's a complex problem. I don't know how much research there is on the officer living in the neighborhood willing a better police experience, but there's definitely a lot of research surrounding empathy, compassion, and the ability to identify with people that you're delivering service to, and whether or not there's a better perception and better outcome out of that.
Great. Yeah, I would say a similar idea living on a military base that would show up at the same time. Would people feel like they never leave the job when you live on a military base?
I would say I lived on a military base in my time, and you're not worried about the enemy attacking you. And this isn't an enemy situation, but your job function is done once you're done for the day in a barracks, and you're not worried about going out and doing that very thing. Whereas as a police officer, if I went to the police station, changed, and then went to the restaurant down the street, I potentially just had a call for service there are still people who are irate. Now, in a large city, it might be easier to live in a different part of the city than in which you police and things like that. But in rural towns, and a majority of police agencies throughout the United States are small police agencies, more difficult. Now, those agencies in rural America do have a lot of people who live in town and police there. But a lot of current activists would argue that the more progressive agencies are major metropolitan agencies. The outcome of getting, having more trust in your police agency, having a better experience with officers that you engage with, there's a lot of questions there, a lot left to be looked at, in whether or not that would be beneficial or not.
Okay, there's a couple more questions coming in the chat, and I still have one too, so we're definitely going to have questions for a few more minutes. All right, Ponfan has asked in the chat how you transfer the real training to the virtual training. So maybe you can explain a little bit more about that.
So that's a great question. When I came over here, one of the things that we did immediately is we tried to align all of our training. So when I came on the job 20 years ago, I got in the car, and the old guy who was my field training officer said, "All right, forget everything you learned in the academy. You're on the streets now. Now you're going to learn the real job." And that's a problem. And it's a problem if you are trying to create best outcomes and align your training with what actually is happening on the street. So one of the first things that I did when I got over here, along with my partner over on the academy side, is we aligned all of our training. We first of all brought our field training unit into the training division building and academy. So now those people interact. And I started what we call the advanced officer training team, whose permanent job assigned is the training division in which they administer this graduate level training. I brought them into the training division building as well. And now all of those employees interact and work together to administer training. So my employees on the advanced side assist with the academy, and the academy assists, the academy instructors assist with the advanced officer training team, and same with the field training staff, all interact together to align that training. And that's where you get actual change and actual outcomes on the street. We're actually doing a training delivery right now with the, it's as a quick example, extraction from a vehicle. If you have somebody that you want to step out of the vehicle, what's the safest way to get someone to step out of a vehicle if you suspect that they're armed or that they're going to try to fight? So we administer a specific procedure in which you do some control holds and make sure that you move them to a specific position. We did that along with our academy staff. They're now teaching that in the academy. We did that, we're delivering that to officers out on the street, and we are delivering that with our field training officers. So everybody in the organization is getting the same message on the same training. And earlier this morning, I got 2 different emails with 2 different calls where officers were like, hey, this thing worked and we did it on the street. It was fantastic. Keep teaching it. And an organization of, over 1,000, that's great. That's great feedback. And it's a proof that what you're trying to train is actually transferring to the street in a safer method to accomplish a task.
Great. All right. There's another question in the chat. Do you create your own VR training?
That's a great question. And that depends on vendor to vendor. And it's one of our metrics that we have been using in order to determine what vendors we do and do not use. So we have a particular VR system in which Post put out and distributed to 50 agencies throughout California. That system has some ability to author a scenario, but it's difficult. It takes significant effort, and we have officers doing this, not computer programmers. So yes, the ability is there to do it. Now, there's other vendors, one of which we are working in contract right now, where it is not a set story mode. So several of the vendors have a set story mode, and you go into a disturbance, and you, as the operator, if the officer does a good job in talking to the person de-escalating, the operator hits a button that says, suspects de-escalated, or calm down, or whatever the command is. And the avatar or suspect in the virtual world reacts accordingly. Or if the officer does a poor job and escalates the situation, they can attack the officer, all of those things. But it's kind of a branched story in which the officer is traveling. There are vendors, and one that we're working on acquiring right now, where it's an open world, and the operator actually acts as the voice and controls all the movements of the person. And this vendor creates environments in which officers can do. And this is a really big and important ability for us. So yeah. Many of you probably saw the terrible situation where a 16-year-old girl, I think it was in Cincinnati perhaps, where she's in a big fight with some family members, and she tries to stab at one of her family members, and the officer shows up on scene, and tragedy all the way around. But if there was a particular training goal that we wanted to accomplish at our department, we could build that very quickly with the vendor we're currently acquiring, and put all of our officers through that scenario that we just saw on MSNBC, and say, oh my goodness, we need to make sure that all our officers know what to do in this type of situation, and apply some sort of training scenario to accomplish a training goal or deliver a policy or ensure that we have clear understanding of how we want officers to accomplish a task. And that's the beauty of being able to author ones. Now, flip side of that, if there are the vendors that do create scenarios that are set and branched, they create libraries. And they create libraries that, you know, a bunch of agencies can contribute to the vendor saying, hey, we need a scenario on this, or we need a scenario on that. And those can be beneficial because maybe the agency themselves haven't thought of that scenario, and you could go and browse that. So we actually are gonna have a couple of different VR systems that we're gonna use for different purposes for that very reason, so that we have the advantages of several. Now we're a fairly large agency. We have the resources to be able to do that. Not all agencies have that. So that's where the gap starts to occur in training. So when we get, you know, when the Sacramento Police Department is getting protested for something that happened in Iowa, it's difficult. You know, it's difficult for us in the profession to understand why we're getting a different standard applied. I understand why as a citizen, but it definitely creates a gap in the professionalism. And that's where that gap occurs that I was talking about across the United States, is how much does a local citizenry want to invest in their police officers to make sure that they have the best training, have the best opportunity to succeed and administer in a way that builds trust instead of destroying it.
Great. We are coming up to the top of the hour, and I actually think what I would like to do is perhaps I'm going to start wrapping us on the production of this live stream. But there are still more questions coming in on the chat and more questions we can discuss. So is it okay with you, Lieutenant Bales, if we wrap for the recording, and then we're just going to keep you on stage and we're going to keep talking live? How does that sound?
Sure, sounds great.
All right, thank you. So I'll face a little bit more towards the audience. The main event has finished. Can I get a round of applause for Lieutenant Bales so far? That's F4 on your keyboard is clapping. Thank you very much. Main event is finished. We're going to close the live stream now, but we're going to stick around for a few minutes to do a little bit more Q&A. Thank you again to our videographers, Tony Cube Studios, and the YouTube audience. Go ahead and end the recording.